And again, I welcome you to the second day of the third International Conference on Cordillera Studies 3. This is a virtual conference hosted by the Cordillera Studies Center, University of the Philippines, Baguio. My name is Christian Ezequiel Fajardo, and I will serve as your moderator for the panel session 2. So before I introduce our panel speaker for this morning, and while you're sipping coffee at home or hearing the crow of your neighbor's rooster, I would just like to greet and acknowledge some participants in the chat box. Who do we have here? We have here Ver Galang Adviento from North Luzon, Philippines State College, and Sheila Angkaway watching all the way from SDO Apayao Danginan Elementary School. Now, speaking of participants, we would like to request you to send your questions for Dr. Settee in the Q&A panel at the bottom of the screen. And then we will read and ask them right away after Dr. Settee's presentation. So without further ado, allow me to introduce our panel speaker for this morning. Dr. Priscilla Settee is a member of Cumberland House Swampy Cree First Nations and a professor of Indigenous Studies, where she teaches courses on Indigenous food sovereignty and Indigenous social economies. Dr. Settee is adjunct professor for the Natural Resources Institute at the University of Manitoba, where she serves graduate students on Indigenous food sovereignty. She has won recognition nationally and internationally for her work on Indigenous knowledge systems that spans several continents, including North, Central, and South America, Africa, India, Asia, and the Pacific. In 2008, Dr. Settee was awarded a Global Citizens Award by Saskatchewan Council for International Cooperation and was twice nominated for a Teaching Excellence Award by her students. In 2012, Dr. Settee received the University of Saskatchewan's Provost Award for Teaching Excellence in Aboriginal Education in 2013. In 2013, she was awarded the Queen Elizabeth Diamond Jubilee Award for contributions to Canada. Dr. Settee is the author of several books, Pimatisiwin, Global Indigenous Knowledge Systems in 2013, that looks at global Indigenous knowledge systems and the strength of women, a Kamaymok in 2011 that examines the role of Indigenous women's stories in establishing truth, reconciliation, and social change. Dr. Settee's latest co-edited book is called Indigenous Food Systems Concepts, Cases and Conversation, published in 2020. Her other research includes gang exiting Indigenous youth, Indigenous social economies, and climate change impact of Indigenous knowledge systems. And she is a kokum, or grandmother, to Naya Lily and Lola Rose, and is a founding member of the City Park Community Garden and Children of the Earth Aboriginal High School in Winnipeg. Dr. Settee serves on the Sea Change Canada Board and is an executive member of the Canadian Association of University Teachers and is a past David Suzuki Fellow from 2019 to 2020 and a current fellow with the US-based NDN Collective. ICCS 3 to talk about the Indigenous knowledge system solving the development crisis of capitalism. It is my pleasure to introduce our panel speaker, Dr. Priscilla Settee. Dr. Settee.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm going to move right into my presentation. But I would like to thank the organizing committee for this amazing opportunity with one of my favorite regions of the world, the Philippines, of which I have quite a long history of friendships and collegial relationships, having been to the Cordillera several times to present at one conference there. And now this time as well. And I'm so happy when I hear that your university has now developed a PhD program in Indigenous studies, and you are part of the growing movement for Indigenous liberation. So congratulations to you. Congratulations to the committee for putting this conference on, even though it had to be once postponed from last year. So I'm going to, you gave me a nice long introduction, and I want to just focus a little bit on that to give you more of a frame of reference of, the work I do, and I guess how it relates somewhat to your work as well. So the various posts that I am involved in were nicely outlined by the person who introduced me. So I won't go into that, but just to say that my presentation really leapfrogs from these various posts that I hold. And I'm a northerner from the northern part of our province in Canada. And so it's mostly tribal people that live in this northern area. And so our frame of reference is very much land-based and very much, in the center of very wealthy resource lands that unfortunately are not always shared with our communities. It's like the model of development that I'm sure exists in, the Philippines, as in the rest of the world, that oftentimes transnational corporations come into the communities and take the wealth of resources out and refine them in other places of the world or the country, leaving very few benefits to the people whose lands have been disrupted by that. That certainly has been the development model, the colonial development model that impacts the world's 400 million peoples globally. And so over the decades that I've been an activist scholar, whatever region of the world I go into, it's pretty much the same story of what we call raping and pillaging of the amazing resources that exist within the homelands of Indigenous peoples. So my research, as mentioned earlier, has taken place in South Africa, South America, the Philippines, South Pacific, Vanuatu, Hawaii, Peru, Bolivia, India, Asia, where I've been involved not only with the scholarly, but also the community-based movements. And in 2013, I pulled my PhD research together into a book called Bimatsuin, Global Indigenous Knowledge Systems. And there I met with people in the Philippines, in particular in the Cordillera, but also in Manila and other places, to talk about the amazing work that's been taking place in the Philippines. Similarly, that same year in South Africa, where an Indigenous knowledge conference that I organized in the mid-2000s was attended by African scholars from all over the continent. And they were very much interested in what differentiates the Indigenous knowledge systems from mainstream and colonial forms of knowledge. So this literature and these actions and these relationships have been taking place over decades, where people are simply not satisfied with the colonial model of education and are really digging deep into their own roots to discover the amazing body of knowledge that has sustained our communities for many, many, many decades and centuries. And so those are some of the stories that I talked about in that research book, in that PhD research that culminated into the book called Bimatsuin. And then prior to that, but the book was also republished or reprinted was Akimemok, The Strength of Women. And in that, I interviewed 15 women from my assorted communities that I worked within, and really documented all the wonderful stories based on the women's stories of community activism and the strength of women. And in 2020, myself and Dr. Shayla Shukla from the University of Winnipeg pulled together the Indigenous Food Systems, which is a compilation of 15 communities across Canada that are reestablishing their food systems more intentionally, because many of the communities are now suffering from a lot of the pillaging of the natural resources in their lands, as I mentioned earlier. And this has really created great food challenges for the people who live on the land, but also for the people who no longer can sustain themselves on the land, and they have to come into the communities, the urban communities, for housing and sometimes employment and just basic necessities of life. So this is certainly true. I use my own community of Cumberland House as kind of a case study of what the colonial process has done to, people in a general state. But it's also a good case model to understand the entire process of colonization, because in many of our communities, we have inadequate education, we have inadequate healthcare, we have virtually no infrastructural development. So in many cases, it's like living in third world countries. And so, I'm taking a little bit of time to explain the commonality that we share with other Indigenous peoples throughout the globe, and not to depress people, but to look at it as a material reality that we as scholars and people who want to transform the academic world really need to be training younger scholars on these matters. So I have to say that the Canadian Indigenous Studies movement is a really rapidly growing movement, both within higher learning, public school systems, and on the ground. So this is very hopeful, and it's something that has been developing, I would say, almost since the turn of the century here in Canada, but more recently, probably in the mid 1950s, when this awareness started developing, and people were going off to university and trying to get higher training. So it's been a very exciting evolution of so-called higher education and honoring the knowledge bases that exist within our traditional community. So anytime I went to the Philippines, I was so really delighted to hear the music, see the weavings in Sagada, and to appreciate the music and the culture and the really powerful strength of spirit that, particularly in the Cordillera, where they, stopped huge dam. Even people got killed for standing up for the rights of human or the rights of nature. It meant that much to the people in that region. And it really set an example of what is possible, to what extent we must be prepared to, to protect our land and our livelihood. So I just want to refer to a Living Planet report of 2018 that said that global wildlife populations have fallen by 60% in the last 4 decades. And it is said that here in Canada, mammal populations have dropped by 43%, amphibian and reptile population dropped by 34%, fish population dropped by 20%, and some type of birds have lost between 43 and 69% of their populations. And we really notice this on the ground. We don't hear the bird song so often now. So this equates to something roughly in the area of 200 species being lost per day, and over, 1 million species lost to date. In fact, I think it's been said by Indigenous people that it's, in some respects, species are being lost that haven't even been identified by Western scientists as being species. So just to really understand that science doesn't know everything, that people on the land are very familiar with species and understand these rapid disappearances. And then add to that, more than 15,000 scientists from 184 countries have issued a warning that humankind must take immediate action to reverse the effects of climate change, deforestation, and species extinction before it's too late. And so it's not just Indigenous observation that is telling us this, but now scientists are jumping on board and, have produced something called the World Scientist Warning to Humanity that is really very terrifying. And every year, more and more scientists are signing on. Dr. David Suzuki, of whom I've served a fellowship within his international organization, gave a keynote address at our SAS and said, shockingly, that humanity may last till 2100, but that by 2050, we may see half of the world's population disappear. And we know through our encounters and through our communications that Indigenous land protectors are being killed. And I'm aware that many human rights people have been killed in the Philippines and also in other parts of the world. And why are they being killed? Well, they're being killed because they are standing up to agribusiness. Agribusiness is one of the single most destructive forces in the world. And here in my province, I have just completed a research paper for one of our provincial federation of sovereign Indigenous nation on the state of food security in the province. And, we know our people are dying from early death, losing limbs and eyesight from preventable diseases such as diabetes. We also have high infant mortality rates in these communities, in part because water is in critical condition, and water is in very bad shape. There is boil water advisories in 150 of our First Nations communities in Canada. So it's really critical. And these are not statistics that are understood always by the broader public. So it is very much a situation where Indigenous people are living on the fringe of development in a very wealthy country like Canada. So in this report, this food sovereignty report that I authored, it has the struggle for land and freedom at its core. And as the largest contributors to the world's food origins, Indigenous peoples are pushing back against powerful forces that have everything to do with intellectual property rights, land rights, and basic survival. As my research has shown, environmental degradation is a powerful force in First Nations lives and fundamentally impacts what it is to be Indigenous. It has meant poisoned environments and the eventual loss of access to safe traditional foods. So people may not be aware, but once traditional foods are lost, oftentimes the state, of course, like in other regions of the world, promotes really high caloric foods that are really wrong for Indigenous bodies. And so as a result, we have all of these preventable diseases that, are out of sight, out of mind, and a really big concern to people like myself who call ourselves food sovereignists. And the development model has also destroyed a lot of traditional economies. So this is something that by the end of the presentation, I will come full circle to how we can undo all of these critical conditions. So the powerful message of this study is that while communities suffer, Indigenous knowledge is very much alive and has the power and capability to influence and reverse the trend of a suffering world. Indeed, it is this dearth of knowledge and value systems built on Wakotowin, Witsidowin, Bimatsuwin, and other values that will save the suffering of a world taxed and stressed beyond no return. To ensure the continuity of that knowledge and to grow hope in communities, First Nations need to take bold action to ensure our survival and our future. I want to talk a little bit about the industrialized food and global de-agriculturalization. Industrial agriculture, as I'm sure many people are aware, refers to a system of food production and distribution dependent on fossil fuel inputs, such as fertilizers, pesticides, machinery, and gasoline. And it is also characterized by the replacement of labor, small farmers, with capital-intensive production and distribution technology for mass production. And I think people will probably be aware that in the Philippines during the Green Revolution, the Green Revolution had great capacity to produce more food, but the problem was who was in control of the production of the food and who was in control of the distribution. And so in the Philippines, it was recorded as saying that so much grain was overproduced that it sat in silos and contributed to an overpopulation, like a rat infestation, because it wasn't being distributed. And so that was one of the main criticisms of the Green Revolution, was while it had capacity to produce more food, it wasn't being distributed. It was in the hands of the corporate league, and therefore it really did little or nothing to alleviate hunger on the ground. A broader examination of industrial agriculture reveal large economic costs known as externalities, frequently ignored by economists who tend to focus on a narrow range of variables to interpret efficiency and economies of scale. The rapid emergence of environmental and public health costs, particularly in the livestock sector, have revealed the weaknesses of traditional economic analysis. So in my work, I go beyond the traditional neoliberal economic analysis to consider things about social economies. So industrial agriculture has led to a resurgence of Indigenous food systems, knowledge, and practices known as food sovereignty. And we have learned a great deal from the so-called developing regions of the world. For example, globally, over 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity is found within Indigenous peoples' lands and territories. And if this is where, and I'm not telling anybody here any new information, but this is where the breadth and depth of knowledge around food production really exists and really needs to be focused on to protect it. So Indigenous knowledge systems are absolutely essential, as we are the unrecognized growers and cultivators of most of the world's foods. And as I mentioned earlier, communities are plagued by food-related illnesses in both the rural and the urban. So this food insecurity has led to a massive global food sovereignty resurgence led largely by women. And many will be familiar with the La Via Campesina, that has become a very powerful force. So it's very incumbent on those of us in this Zoom call to understand the importance of international linkages and working, teaching, and research, to understand, the challenges at hand. Not the least of which is climate change, which is directly as a result of energy policies that depend on fossil fuel production. Risk assessment policies that don't protect Indigenous lands and resources, and environmental health, impacts on how economic globalization, regional, bilateral, and global trading mechanisms such as the free trade agreements and other free trade agreements and Western forms of development are simply non-sustainable. And yet it, interestingly, is the model of development, the dominant model. So by now, most people understand the strength of these international trade agreements that prefer the governments of the North, the most powerful and rich communities of the North and the West, that live off the backs of the developing nations, so-called developing nations. So whenever I get an opportunity to speak and to meet new colleagues in different regions of the world, I explain it from a very solidaritist perspective. That, as an academic, I feel it's really important to focus on these solidaritist relationships that help to explain what's happening in the Philippines with the degradation, but also with the tremendous growth of intellectual initiatives. And these are the things that push us forward as societies, that push us forward as Indigenous academics, people who are speaking, representing our communities. And to understand that, these massive pushback strategy that we're all a part of, that this conference is a part of, huge part of, are made up of really exciting youth, Indigenous peoples, civil society, trade unions, and academics. And, I'm not saying it to flatter the Philippines, but I have always been tremendously inspired by the political analysis of some of the people I've worked with in the Philippines, that your ability to work with trade unions really solidly has been nothing short of inspirational. Your land rights people, your ability to stave off these great development giants has really been so inspirational. So, and no doubt because our generation, represent the last generation to get it right. We know, science tells us, our elders have been telling us that we are on the major horns of an environmental collapse, and this is the last chance that we've got to get it right. So we need hope and reconstruction, and that is really, part of this truth telling. So all over the world, there's been grassroots responses, whether it's been the Nyaleni Food Declaration or similar ones coming out of Central America, or the right to food and food security, energy and water. It seems like the food security sovereignty movement has been a catalyst for other things, energy fights, etc. And if we're not familiar with these declarations, it's really good to be, familiarize ourselves with it, because it's really about a reclamation of traditional values, rebuilding strong communities, putting women and children at the center of development. For today, it is indeed the women and children who are suffering the most. I give examples of communities that have really stood up to the giants and really made a big difference. Maybe the oil companies and some of the water giants that continue to try and privatize water, which we know Bolivia, for example, really said no to the privatization of water. Well, actually, they had it reversed. So the UN in 2015 reported that the demand for water will increase by 55% over the next 15 years. And by that time, global water resources will meet only 60% of the world's demand. Here in Canada, we have two of our major rivers, one that I live on in the city here, that are the most endangered river systems in Canada. So we know firsthand that, extensive use by agricultural companies are really usurping our water at a rapid rate. And, it's very fearsome that our little grandchildren may not know fresh water when they become our age. So what we need in Canada and probably in other parts of the world is a strong national plan of action based on a new water ethic that puts water protection and water justice at the heart of all our policies and laws. And we currently don't have that, although, again, like in many parts of Canada, these fights are going on. And at the center of all of this is Indigenous sovereignty, which is currently at the forefront of protecting the rights to a clean environment for Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And the recent Enbridge pipeline decision is a part of broader movement for decolonization that seeks to restore land back to Indigenous people and implement a much more comprehensive framework for environmental justice. So at the heart of Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination are 6 principles, and I'm just going to read them. It focuses on development for the people, it values people, it localizes development systems, it puts control locally, it builds knowledge and skills, particularly among our young ones, and most importantly, it works with nature, as we have seen in the Cordillera. When I was there, I walked to the Batan rice paddies, which are the 2,000-year-old rice paddies, and they're powerful to see them. So I'm just going to wrap up in about 6 minutes, but I just want to point to a couple of our positive stories around how to build economies that matter. And one of the companies that I work with and really love is the Aki Energy Enterprise, which operates on social economy principles. So basically, social economy models of economic development can be used to build alternative economic structures that will reduce the poverty and social exclusion of Aboriginal peoples and others, particularly in times of globalization and the intensification of neoliberal and market-driven economic development. So the definition of social economy is that they have a social mission that guides their program and policies. And some examples in Canada, at least, are early childhood centers, domestic health services, recycling centers, public and community-based housing, social, recreation, and tourism initiatives, culture, communications, and more. Now, historically, the social and cultural structure of First Nations communities has operated on the basis of collaboration and mutual aid. In fact, we could not exist in this really, really cold temperature unless we knew how to collaborate and knew how to coexist. Survival was ensured by cooperating with each other in small or large group. Each had a role to play in the social, cultural, and economic functioning of the family, clan, and community. And today, First Nations attach great importance to the group and to collective harmony. Solidarity, sharing, personal autonomy, respect for ecosystems, and the land are all core values. So the social economy is rooted in the realization that the economy isn't someone else's business. There is another way to organize the economy besides a neoliberal approach. The social economy responds to society's need, including quality of life, job creation, respect for the environment, use of natural resources, and access to communication, among others. Both are rooted in an approach based on democracy, partnership, cooperation, and community development. Through these social values, social economy becomes a model of development adopted or adapted to the social and cultural realities of land-based peoples. Social, in the phrase social economy, refers to a contribution by an enterprise that goes beyond an economic contribution. It is not just about making money. The social contribution of an enterprise may be defined as the promotion of values such as democracy and autonomy. And I know all over the world, communities are really re-establishing democratic forms of governance because there is the rise of fascism in the world as well. And Indigenous people are a great part of this reestablishment of the democratic process. Here in Canada, we've had major selection of strong women leaders to head up many powerful organizations. That's been very recently. But also, interestingly enough, as a university professor, I note that women are really leading in the academic movement and training and are succeeding in great numbers. So it's really a very interesting time to be a scholar. We're seeing great change, we're seeing great improvement, but of course, you know, neoliberalism has ensured that also the conditions have gotten lots more wicked. So we see like tremendous suffering, the development of gangs and family breakdown and environmental devastation. So really, you know, the time to act is now. And by meeting in forums like this, I think it really feeds our spirit to understand that we are part of a global movement that is not backing down, that has the answers, and that has the creativity to be more for the unborn future children of this world. So I'm almost done here. So success of social economies is ensured through the adoption of a shared vision where everyone's opinion and ideas are given consideration. The emergence of a shared leadership. You know, we don't need the 1% to lead for us. We need the 99%. And that 1% versus the 99% has become a really popular phrase, that how much longer will we allow the 1% to profit off the spoils of the earth while the rest of us suffer, you know, to greater and lesser extents. Success is ensured through cooperation and multi-sectoral collaboration, the contribution of the social commitment of citizens and community mobilization, proper management of development projects, access to financing and support services for social and group entrepreneurship. Oftentimes, you know, we have to take what governments put towards development projects, and a lot of times it's not uphill thinking, it's really downhill thinking. So the same money could be invested in upstream planning and do, you know, prevent a lot of the suffering that currently takes place through the, you know, the overpopulation in jails, the health crises, the educational crises. So these are all things that need to be figured into the economic order. And of course, the development of Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal partnerships, inter-regional and international cooperation, which we've seen happening at the UN and other places, such as this forum. And to finally understand that the social economy framework exists in all sectors of the economy: production, finance, distribution, exchange, consumption, governance, to uproot oppressive structures and fundamental governance systems, and superficial change to those systems. So we're looking for deep, meaningful, almost revolutionary kinds of movements here, which I know Philippines is no stranger to. So the social solidarity economy is an alternative to capitalism and other authoritarian state-dominated economic systems that focus on the desires of the 1%, and ordinary people play an active role in shaping all the dimensions of human life, economic, social, cultural, political, and environmental aspects. Finally, part of my job in the Academy is to teach this model of development in a course that I developed called Indigenous Community Development into the 21st Century. We look at addressing the deepening poverty and deteriorating living conditions. We look at the deep environmental degradation provoked by an extractive, intensive, and extensive linear economic model leading to widespread pollution and climate change, and finally development models that respect Indigenous sovereignty and land rights. In closing, I just want to mention that this year I've been named an Indian fellow with the Indian Collective based in the United States. And the mission of this collective is to build the collective power of Indigenous peoples, communities, and nations to exercise our inherent right to self-determination while fostering a world that is built on a foundation of justice and equity for all people and the planet. It's also built on the defense model. We must continue to defend our people, communities, and nations against negative resource extraction that poisons our people, pollutes our water, destroys our land, contributes to climate change, and violates human rights. Doing this through organizing our communities, making our voice heard, and utilizing a wide variety of tactics is imperative in shifting the political and financial systems that are impacting our communities. And needless to say, the youth have been a huge part of that solution. Finally, to decolonize. Decolonization needs to be at the center of all of our actions. We must continue to decolonize our minds, communities, and sovereign nations. The decolonization of our communities and people is directly related to our ability to prosper. Through the revitalization of our Indigenous ceremonies, culture, languages, and lifeways, we will continue to strengthen our identity and break free from the oppressive systems that disconnect us from achieving the healing growth and connection to spirit that is integral for us as Indigenous people. And to develop. We must continue to develop Indigenous communities in a regenerative and sustainable manner based on our values, our connection to land, culture, and identity. We need to meet the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. We are doing this through regenerative community development, renewable energy investments, and social enterprise development. Finally, in closing, I just want to say that hope has two sisters, anger and courage. Anger at the way things are and courage to change them. So I just want to thank everyone for listening. I know it's really hard to just listen to a screen, but my most important message here is that we are a collective, that we are united by our vision for an equitable future based on Indigenous justice. And we are not alone in this struggle. We are part of an ever-growing body of hope that exists. So thank you for listening, and I will stick around for a short while if there are questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Settee, for that presentation. And allow me to give my takeaway with regard to your presentation, which I think can be summed up with ICCS, right? So the first is letter I, based on what we've heard from Dr. Settee's presentation. I think it is important to have international and local cooperation between and among communities. right? So, and of course, I can also usually hear during Dr. Settee's presentation is letter C, two C's, which is collaboration and commitment. And letter S is for shared community success, which we can also attain through a shared vision, a shared leadership, and multi-sectoral collaboration and commitment. All right, so that's ICCS, and we have questions for Dr. Settee. Please write them down below at the question and answer box. But I think, Dr. Settee, we have one question here. The first question is, Dr. Settee, what strategies have you seen succeeding in having indigenous knowledge be the base of developmental rather than neoliberal concepts?
Well, I think first of all, as I mentioned earlier, it's really important to start from a place of decolonization.
Mm-hmm.
So decolonization is a place where we look at working with the youth, working with the women, working with the impacted community, and then, really talking about a liberation kind of ideology. And that has what I have noticed in the Philippines. Extremely sharp intellectual analysis of the problem at hand. And without that intellectual, organic kind of analysis, it's very difficult to move forward. So really important to have, the base that is really oppressed in our communities to be at the table in much the same way that social economies operate, where everybody's voices are heard. That, we're really at a really difficult time in our history where we've seen, such tremendous climate change that we're not guaranteed to be living here in 50 years' time. And so it means that all people need to be on deck. The other piece that is very needed at this point is resistance and creativity and using various aspects of culture to survive and to create new answers. And again, the artists of our community have always been called the first revolutionaries. And so these are ways that we can creatively educate our people, our youth, because not everybody's literate, like literate in the sense of learning to read. So yeah, I think that there's an urgency to really mobilize, and I've been part of that over the decades. And but I feel that we still need to go further, farther, and bring in more people, bring in more allies, work with the churches, work with the trade unions, work with the agriculturalists, the small farmers, the women's groups, the youth. The youth are tremendously inspirational, and I love working with the youth. So those are some points that I'm focusing on in my own work.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Settee. We have questions here. Like this one. Good morning, Dr. Settee. The current food production scheme is enabled by what you call fossil fuel dependent system. Do you think that there is a potential for indigenous knowledge on food production to be applied in large-scale food production?
Yes, there's not only possibilities, but it is a reality. For example, the corporate industrial agriculture model is also always given the credit that they produce the most food in the world, when in fact it's peasant farmers that produce the most, feed the most people, are the least offensive to land, and require the fewest resources. And there's some excellent work that's being done by Genetic Resources International, GRAIN, if people are familiar with that group, and the etc. group that has done the solid research about just how much peasant farmers, women farmers, indigenous farmers contribute to the world food system. So it's a model that we need to return to, and to say no to, the big scientific answers only to food production.
Okay. Thank you. Another question, Dr. Settee. Authentic indigenous products are certainly not cheap to produce. How can we teach consumers to value indigenous products?
Well, I think, we need to understand how the mainstream products are subsidized by our governments. I remember in the Philippines, my good friend Corazon Favros said, Priscilla, here are 2 apples in the market in Manila. And the local apple was, say, 60 cents, and the imported apple was 40 cents. So you can see people would be tempted to buy the imported apple because it was cheaper. But we need to understand, and we need to pressure governments to stop subsidizing the corporate sector so that the little farmer loses. We have cases in India of farmers taking their lives because they can no longer compete with subsidized farm products. So we need to understand that, and we need to fight to change that. We certainly are doing that in Canada.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yes, thank you. Another question here. How can we view the experiences and breakthroughs of an IT-led leaning national government in Bolivia in 2006 up until the right-wing coup in 2019? The Evo Morales government was consistent in pushing back against capitalism. It instituted a Ministry of Cultures, decolonization, and depatriarchalization. They were constantly under attack by right-wing fascist forces supported by foreign powers and corporations. The question I think here is, what are the lessons and opportunities can we learn from the Bolivian experience in terms of advancing indigenous knowledge and systems and struggling against neoliberal globalization?
Well, I think that, we have to name these oppressive systems like capitalism and fascism, and we also need to name socialism as a good force. And about a year ago, meeting with a collection of countries that identify as socialist to strengthen the power of these countries. And Bolivia was one of them. And of course, it wasn't very long that the right wing were again destroyed in Bolivia after the right wing took over. And then, international pressure, fabulous organizing from within the country destroyed that fake government of Bolivia for a while. It was in power for not very long. And and so it's really important that we in the so-called developed regions understand the power that our governments are doing to keep the poorer countries and regions of the world on their knees. Our requirements through free trade agreements are totally at the heart of what's wrong with international governance systems. Poor little countries cannot afford to compete with, all of the power and wealth of these very powerful Western and Northern governments. So I certainly make that part of my teaching, that my students understand the power of and the greed of our Northern governments, and that it's important for us to act in solidarity with countries that are struggling. And there's many countries that are struggling. So we have our work to do in the North, and it certainly is through developing solidaritous actions, some of which we don't have to do it all ourselves, like which is being done by the churches and by trade unions and women's movements, small farm. I think, really the small farm movement is one of the most revolutionary forces on earth, and it's what's going to pull us together, that and the fight for water rights.
Thank you. Interesting questions are coming. In your visit and studies throughout indigenous communities in different parts of the world, what percentage of these communities win over corporate colonial capitalism, especially when their land and natural resources are being threatened? What did they do to stand against these big corporations? And also, I don't know if this, I think it's in relation to your presentation as well. Indigenous food has always been identified as healthy and make use of natural ingredients, which is safe for consumption, and uses natural resources in the right way. The question is, how can we promote indigenous food? I think this is an interesting question, especially to the young generation, now that commercial and healthy food is readily available everywhere at any time. Your thoughts, Dr. Settee?
I think we can be very intentional about where we spend our money. We can also do things like, I'm part of a food movement that really supports the gifting of free seeds of plants to make sure that we continue the production of these foods, because we've lost dozens and dozens and dozens of types of foods, like, the ones we're very familiar with, like cabbage and lettuce and tomato, carrots, onions, turnips. We've lost so many of the varieties of those. And I have, in some of my presentations, I have a map that shows how many varieties we've lost over the years. So as individual consumers, we can really be intentional about the foods we eat. We can even take a risk and become a grower. And like in my community, we successfully established over 60 community gardens. If you go to Cuba, it's just, and it was only in 15 years we did that. And these are the things that also build community, by working together and enjoying good food. And so, but tragically, we are also losing so much natural resources that we are losing a lot of the animals, the big animals, the birds that we once consumed, which were healthy. And so a lot of my research talks about what we need to do is to stop the licensing of our lands, stop the laws that are being written, give, companies carte blanche to our land. And this takes some sophistication, but I think it also, there's two routes. There's the militant route, where you place your body on the land, like you've done in the Philippines, to stop the dam. And people died, and people continue to die. And it's certainly a really serious issue of so many Indigenous people being murdered for their beliefs and for their land protection. And then there's the slap suits, that we know that people have been slapped with suits when they talk about the inequities of development. People have ended up dead, or, that's a very real, a real problem in Indigenous communities. And the biggest perpetrator is the agrochemical companies.
Thank you. We have interesting discussion points here, but I think I can only entertain one question, Dr. Settee. And I think this question, just to merge other questions, you think what is the best strategy to influence national government to protect the environment? Even several national parks are not really protected from land conversion. Your takeaway, Dr. Settee?
Oh, there's this phenomena going on in the world today of land grabs. And I don't know how many land grabs you have in the Philippines, but I know all over the world, even in my province, there are land grabs. So we need to have citizens understand that this is a direct violation of democracy at its very center. The democracy that I talked about, that reorganizing economies is really about taking back our democracy, reestablishing democracy. Every era of youth needs to be trained in that reestablishment of democracy. So, it's gotten to be just one big land grab, and the corporations don't stop with their greed to pursue on the backs of many Indigenous poor people. So I think it's very important to understand the extent of the problem in order to start a fight back strategy wherever in the world we live, but to also understand that we are part of this very vocal growing collective, and that there is hope. So I think there's about 133 people on this call, and if each one is probably doing something very great in their daily work, but to expand that even further and to draw more people in is a good step.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Settee. Yes, collaboration, cooperation is very important. To is very important for this kind of topic that we have. Now, let's have a virtual congratulations for Dr. Settee. Allow me to read this certificate. It says here that the Third International Conference on Cordillera Studies, this is the certificate of appreciation, and it's being presented to Professor Priscilla Settee, PhD, for imparting her knowledge and experience as plenary speaker during the Third International Conference on Cordillera Studies, held on 5, 12, 19, and 26 July 2021 in Baguio City. Given this 12th day of July 2021, signed by Chancellor Corazon Elabansi of University of the Philippines, Baguio, and the director of the Cordillera Studies Center, Professor Ruth M. Tindaan. Why don't we give a virtual congratulations and a virtual appreciation to our speaker, Dr. Settee. So Dr. Settee, on behalf of the ICCS 3, we would like to give the certificate of appreciation to you.
Thank you very much. I very much appreciate your work and the invitation to be here.
All right. So once again, thank you very much, Dr. Settee. And before we leave this panel presentation, allow me to read some instructions or some guidelines with regard to our some few announcements for the day 2 of the ICCS 3. Parallel session 3 up next after your coffee break will be the parallel session 3, panels 9 to 12. So the panels are now online. You can now enter the panel, and live stream videos are available on our website. So visit us at bit.ly/virtual ICCS3. And also, live stream links are also posted on our Facebook page. So again, on behalf of the ICCS3, we thank you everyone for your participation in Dr. Settee's panel presentation. So we'll just have a short virtual coffee break, and up next, the parallel sessions 9 to 12 at 10:45 in the morning until 12 noon. So have a great day, everyone, and good morning. Thank you, Dr. Settee.